Now I will welcome everybody. Welcome everybody. My name is Professor Valerie Osterveld. I'm from the Faculty of Law at Western University, and I'm also the Associate Dean of Research at the Faculty of Law. And we're very excited to have you here today for this event on talking about social justice issues and the difference that research into social justice makes within our communities. This event is sponsored by Western University and also the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists. So it really is a collaboration between the two institutions. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that Western University and this museum are situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaran peoples who have long-standing relationships to the land and region of southwestern Ontario and to the City of London. The local First Nation communities of this area include the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. In the region, there are 11 First Nations communities and a growing Indigenous urban population. This museum itself is adjacent to a reconstruction of the Lawson site, which is a 16th century pre-contact neutral Iroquois village. So it's very fitting that we're holding this event here today at this museum. And this museum is an affiliated research institute of Western University. So all of you know Western University, I suspect. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the Royal Society of Canada and the College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists. The Royal Society of Canada is not a monarchist institution, as many people often think. It is an organization recognizing career excellence by academics at universities across Canada in arts, humanities, natural, and social sciences. And the College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists, which I'll just call the College of New Scholars because that's a very long name, is Canada's first national system of multidisciplinary recognition for the emerging generation of Canadian intellectual leadership. It comprises a fourth entity within the Royal Society of Canada. There are 3 academies focused on sciences and humanities and arts, and this is the fourth entity. There are 219 members of the college who are Canadians and permanent residents at an early stage in their career at universities across Canada. And the members represent 55 Canadian universities and research institutions from across the country. I myself joined the Royal Society's College of New Scholars in 2014. Now, the College of New Scholars is hosting a series of events today across Canada at universities and in cities across Canada to celebrate, to mark the 150th anniversary of Canadian Confederation, while also thinking forward to the next 150 years. And these events are in Halifax, Montreal, this one here in London, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. And they're all taking place at approximately the same time. If any of you happen to be live tweeting from this event, I encourage you to use hashtag WesternU, hashtag Wave150, and or hashtag College of New Scholars. So I'm going to turn to the first part of our event today, which is a discussion between Professor Joanna Quinn and Professor Cheryl Suzak. And I'm asked Professor Quinn and Professor Suzak to come up to the table, and then I will introduce both of you. I'm going to start with Professor Cheryl Suzak, who's at the end here, who's a professor of English at the University of Toronto. And we thank you, Cheryl, for coming in from Toronto today to be a part of our event. Her research focuses on Indigenous law and literature with a particular emphasis on writing by Indigenous women. In her book, Indigenous Women's Writing and the Cultural Study of Law, she explores how Indigenous women's writing from Canada and the United States addresses case law concerning tribal membership, intergenerational residential school experiences, and land claims. She's cross-appointed to the Aboriginal Studies program and teaches courses for English and Aboriginal Studies on comparative Indigenous literatures, comparative Indigenous studies, and Indigenous decolonization with a focus on gender issues. Cheryl will be elected to the college in November. so she's almost a part of the college of scholars. Professor Joanna Quinn is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of Western's Center for Transitional Justice and Post-Conflict Reconstruction. Her research considers the role of acknowledgement in overcoming the effects of conflict and abuse. She's written widely on the role of acknowledgement in truth commissions and in customary law in Haiti, Uganda, Canada, Fiji, Solomon Islands. Have I forgotten anywhere? Sorry. She was appointed to the college in 2015. Thank you.
So what Cheryl and I thought, well, what I thought of what I wrote Cheryl into today, was that we might be able to have a short conversation about what reconciliation looks at the 150th celebration of Canada. It's a complicated question, lots of things that we would like to talk about. So I've come up with a list of questions that I thought we could talk about, and they relate both to the work that both Cheryl and I have done, and also to the things that are in the contemporary social media complex and things that we think are important to talk about. So the first question that I thought we could consider was the kind of work that we have both done related to reconciliation generally. And as Valerie said, I have worked in Uganda and Haiti, Fiji, Solomon Islands on truth commissions, specifically commissions of inquiry or public inquiries that are convoked to look into human rights abuses that have been committed in the past. And then I spent 10 years looking at customary practices, traditional practices, that we might use as a way of decolonizing the stigma that surrounds a state-run process, and whether there was utility in us thinking about how people's culture and the customs that they use might be used to that same effect. And for the last 4 years, I've been interested in what makes people care. How do we engage people in this kind of process? So these questions of reconciliation, as Valerie said, I work on acknowledgement, but questions of reconciliation follow close on the heels of that kind of acknowledgement. And that's my interest in the question of reconciliation. What about you?
My direction and commitment to reconciliation really comes out of the teaching I do, and it sort of starts from the groundwork of teaching and trying to connect with students around an idea that they probably don't know a lot about, and that is the idea of the residential schools in Canada. So what I was confronted with as an instructor was, how do I teach students about these issues, this history? How do I put them in touch with the stories and with the idea of voice and experience that they'll encounter in literary texts? But how do I do that by moving them closer to the body of the victim? And it was really that problem that I was confronted by, because there is quite a large body of literature that was written before the Truth and Reconciliation came into effect. And it's material that talks about hard realities, difficult knowledges, intense suffering, critical experiences of choosing life over death. And I wanted them to understand that the voice they're hearing isn't just a one-dimensional voice of suffering, or it isn't just a voice that's about someone who is caught up in social circumstances. I wanted them to know that there was a longer history, and that there was a way in which they could empathize and identify with that voice by thinking about what it might mean to be powerless, or what it might mean to be confined, or what it might mean to be trapped. And so the person I put them in touch with, through her work as Elaine Scarry in The Body and Pain, and I had them think about what it might mean to be a victim of torture, what would it mean to be in a room and know that the footsteps walking up the hall were deliberately designed to amplify and intensify your anxiety. What would it mean to know that at any moment you could be struck without any sense of why you're being hit, or about a sense of appealing to someone to protect you? What would it mean to be powerless and helpless? And then how is that complicated by the idea that you're languageless? Because of course, in the residential schools, children weren't permitted to speak their languages. So I was really struck by this idea that in the literary text, prior to the TRC coming into effect, we had voices that were telling us things that were really important. We didn't study or embrace or engage with those voices at the time. but the opportunity of thinking about the TRC and the way it was asking us to pay attention to things we'd heard but hadn't really understood the meaning of was one of the ways in which we could begin enacting our own measure of reconciliation, but also to try and undo some of our own epistemic ignorance and the way in which we blinded ourselves to knowledges that existed but that we hadn't really thought mattered in the way that they mattered. And they mattered in the sense of we live with people who've been made powerless, we live with people who've been made helpless, and then we've turned to them and assigned agency and said, now go and help yourselves and go and heal yourselves and go and fix the conditions you find yourselves in, without any attention to the circumstances by which people are made into those situations, those positions in society. So it really came out of a teaching question, a practice, a commitment to the rights that we were looking at.
So one of the things I also thought would be useful for Cheryl and I to think a little bit about was how we've been thinking about reconciliation in Canada specifically. And what Cheryl didn't say is that she's also been involved in a project that's working across cultures in South Africa and Canada. So can you talk a little bit about that, your engagement with this kind of question in Canada specifically, maybe in the context of that other work?
Yes, that project came up through the Jackman Humanities Institute and the University of Western Cape. And it's a project that's a South-North dialogue on aesthetic education. And it's really addressed to questions of citizenship and responsibility and rights and education. And it's really interested in the role that the aesthetics can play in those practices. So there's a team of researchers at the University of Western Cape who've put in place a humanities center, and they're bringing in a number of really important voices, young scholars, young emerging and developing scholars who are working on questions of violence, questions of embodiment, questions of how you can use aesthetic objects to put people in touch with memories, with experiences, with different properties, with losses, with a way of being engaged with the world that steps outside of our disciplinary or more familiar frameworks. So they've done some really good work in South Africa. And the collaboration is, we focused our end of the collaboration. One segment of it has many different projects associated with it. We've put ours into conversation with Truth and Reconciliation here in Canada. It's been very interesting to hear the comparative framework, the comparative analysis, where the conversation that we had with representatives who came was that the Commission always understood itself as a truth commission. It was interested in discovering the truth and uncovering the truth and making known the truth. And reconciliation wasn't their goal, or it wasn't the goal attached to the TRC in South Africa. And then the other interesting element of dialogue we've had has to do with what the South African model means now and what we can learn from it. How can we begin to understand some of the dilemmas or some of the problems we face here in Canada when we're looking at truth and reconciliation, with the goal of reconciliation being embraced as the real objective, that we've heard the truth, we know the truth, and now we can step over or past the truth on our way to putting in place the measures that we need for reconciling amongst ourselves. And so what we've learned is that if we're hasty in those steps, we'll miss out on important elements of suffering, of structural relationships that continue to be very divided and very disparate. We'll move too quickly to an idea that reconciliation holds the answers for us without seeing that these embedded structures of violence and disparity and dispossession continue with or without our consent. And I think the South African model has really educated us to our own, I would say, a too hasty move in a direction that may in fact we're not quite ready yet to take up or to understand the implications of. So that dialogue, that conversation has been really important and really valuable in terms of thinking about a model. Just one comment that has come to the foreground as well in talking with the collaborators here at the San Neil Ten Courtner, Courtney Young and Kara Compich. It's hard to make Canada, it's hard to hold Canada accountable. It's hard to reach into Canada's reputation or all the ideas that surround Canada as the kind of nation it is, and sort of point to its injustices. It's very hard to say that these voices existed before the TRC came into effect and people knew, or people were complicit, or people conspired, or people ignored or indifferent. And so Canada's position as a country it's almost unapproachable in terms of its status and its bearing. It's a really difficult position to be in, where you hear about these injustices and you know that they exist and you see the suffering, and yet the model for Canada is very much about a very different idea of what Canada is. And so it's important to step away and try and find other places where knowledge exists, or other examples, or other ways of thinking Canada that can help you sort of overcome those impasses or those barriers to the recognition of the past that Canada has.
For me, I had studied truth and reconciliation and all other kinds of parts of the world. I mean, as a grad student, I was working in Uganda and working on the Haitian case. And so when the residential schools question came to the fore, here in Canada, people would say to me, well, you're a Truth Commission expert, why aren't you talking about this? And I would say, oh, no, I'm a Uganda expert, or I'm an international relations specialist. Those are the things I work on. And so my work in thinking about the Canadian context came about with me really feeling like an outsider. I have specialized knowledge, absolutely, but that specialized knowledge is stuff that has happened in other places, and I didn't think it was my place to talk about those kinds of things in a situation that I really didn't have a lot of knowledge about. I really have come at my thinking about reconciliation in Canada from an outsider position. But the more my colleagues cajoled and convinced, I came to realize that maybe I do have something to contribute to the conversation. Because the question of reconciliation directly impacts me. It impacts my family, it impacts my friends, it impacts my colleagues, it impacts the university where I work. Last year at the Royal Society meetings, for example, one of the conversations we had was that one of the founders of the Royal Society of Canada was the architect of the residential schools. Those are big questions, and people like me with specialized knowledge need to be thinking about these kinds of questions in a way that I wouldn't have considered even 10 years ago. So my sort of entree into this has, I've come backward into it, but with a feeling that as a non-Indigenous Canadian, I have a responsibility to think about this, to teach about it, and to work on these kinds of questions, even when it's really uncomfortable. So the question that I had listed next, and I'm going to throw it to Cheryl first, was how do you think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada on the Indian residential schools has shaped the conversation about reconciliation?
Big question.
That's why I'm asking you first.
I think they've made it into a legal question. I think they've given us a really strong set of recommendations and ideas that we should embrace, and I think they're really, really important. But I think they've steered our conversation in the direction of what legal mechanisms can do. And that's always important and useful and valuable, but it means that we reach for the mechanism without fully exploring the content or the framework, or thinking about if that mechanism is the right place for these conversations to happen. And in thinking about legal mechanisms, it seems to me that they do matter. Of course they matter. But there are other answers that exist. And just in conversation earlier today with Joanna, I was thinking about one of the debates we had quite recently this summer in spring about cultural appropriation. And we were really taken up with the question of how is it we're once again participating and thinking about and needing to think through this question of cultural appropriation. And as you may know, as you may recall, the first cultural appropriation debate arose in 1990 around a television documentary, Where the Spirit Lives, which was focused on residential schools. And it had to do with non-Indigenous representations of residential schools and the way that story was being told. Now, the film itself is fascinating because of its strong casting, its strong acting. Anthony MacDonald, Michelle St. John of Mohawk ancestry. The work that they were doing in that film was about consciousness raising, but its message was very strongly that there's been a mistake, please forgive us. And the problem was, of course, that Indigenous communities had been saying that for years and years and years, and they weren't consulted. They weren't part of the network of people who played a part in the making of that film. And one of the strongest voices at the time, when Keisha Tobias spoke out and said, look, stop stealing Native stories, stop taking our history, stop standing in for us and saying what it is we've been trying to have you hear. Listen to us was really the goal of her voice. She was echoed in that position by Daniel David Moses, Thompson Highway, Basil Johnson, the writers and the cultural people who are so central to making an Indigenous presence in literary form, and in cultural form, and aesthetic form, and making it resonate with an Indigenous content and sensibility and a framework and history. So the people who best know that experience weren't being consulted, and I think knowing that about our culture and our history could tell us something important about the way in which other mechanisms we've reached for may or may not be speaking to the right people, may or may not be consulting with the people who are most directly impacted, may or may not be in consultation with those who know best the stories that need to be told. And so it seems to me that legal mechanisms in that direction are really important, but they may not be the entry points by which Indigenous peoples or Indigenous voices enter into that debate. And so what we might need to do is think about how to give recognition to the cultural activists, the cultural artists, the people who've been speaking for a long time and haven't been heard. And I think we really need to supplement the legal mechanisms and the disciplinary frameworks that we've inherited from the TRC with greater attention to cultural voices, to our writers, to our storytellers, to the traditional knowledge keepers, to the bearers of wisdom, who understand the implication and embeddedness of these stories and stories that come out of Indigenous communities.
For me, I guess I approached the question from a different perspective. And I was thinking about what it is that Canadians now know about Indigenous communities. What is it that Canadians think the TRC has accomplished? And I guess my big worry is that Canadians will think, well then, we've had a Truth Commission. It addresses the problems that those people are having, and we're done. We can wash our hands and go home. It's okay, Isaac, thanks. But what really, thank you, what really worries me is that we now have the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry. And Canadians don't quite know where to put that on the context of problems that are happening over there. And it worries me that Canadians will think that unless and until we have to have some kind of legal mechanism, that there's nothing for us to do in the meantime. And that I think we as Canadians really need to consciously work to connect the dots between the institutions, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry, connect those to questions of promises that have been broken, to things overt as the provision of basic services like water and heat to people on reserve, and then to sort of more nebulous things like discrimination against Indigenous people in the workplace or in the grocery store. And I worry that by institutionalizing those kinds of questions, it lets us as Canadians off the hook. Yeah.
I actually had, I'm really so pleased, I'm so happy you raised the question of the missing and murdered Indigenous women's inquiry, because 2 nights ago we screened Finding Dawn by Christine Welch at the Indigenous Redeemer, Church of the Redeemer in Toronto, and the University of Toronto are collaborating to show documentaries that have to do with Indigenous issues in Canada. And the Indigenous Issues Working Group was part of that collaboration. Finding Dawn was directed in 2000, I think it appeared in 2004, 2006, and it has to do with Vancouver's downtown east side, the Trail of Tears, the kind of movement and displacement of people on the prairies, and the missing and murdered Indigenous women who are voices that are speaking to us out of those histories. One of the responses of the audience was quite telling. They said this was made 10 years ago and we haven't come far at all. And it was really a sobering moment of recognition, because there are expectations and there are really strong, urgent voices who want to participate, and yet those voices haven't been heard. And the other element of that film that I think is so important is we have in Christine Welch, the director, who's a professor emeritus for women's studies at University of Victoria, we have an example, a model of how to have these voices participate. So she went into the communities and she spoke to the on-the-ground activists, she spoke to the families, she heard the stories, she recovered and placed them into the tribal histories that from which these women emerge, and she redignified them, made them more than a missing person. And the film is powerful because she did that. It's powerful because she showed us how to. And I think that's what we need to learn from cultural artists like Christine Welch, who understand the dynamics amongst Indigenous peoples. What we can learn from the film, looking back at our own history and realize that very little has changed in 10 years, and our own sense of incredible frustration and hope that a government commission could achieve more, in the sense in which the promise and the reality still seem quite far apart. There's a widening gap between them.
I think maybe you just answered it, but the last question that I wanted us to think about was how you would encourage Canadians to think about reconciliation in a more holistic way. Maybe that's your answer.
I think it's in part, absolutely. To my mind, one of the things that didn't happen, but maybe it did, and I'm just not aware of it. One of the things I wanted to celebrate are the people who've been active and who've been voices participating and speaking about social justice for Indigenous peoples. Something to honor Basil Johnson, who passed on a couple of years ago now, I think. Beth Brandt, who passed on a couple of years ago. People who've been are artists who've spoken to us again and again, and who have always believed in the aesthetic form, have believed in storytelling, believed in the value and the importance of culture to Canadians, and in participating have given us these objects that we can explore and analyze and engage with, and not have to move outside of our area where we're comfortable and able to take in the messages that they're giving us. And I think we need to honor our artists more than we do. I think we need to pay more attention to those voices. I think we have to look to that element of leadership, that element of sacrifice, and that element of commitment and dignity that they've provided us with. And I think we should be much more strongly committed to our writers, our storytellers, our wisdom keepers, the people who've made the world better because their voices are a part of it. So I think I do have to emphasize how much I believe in legal mechanisms, but I believe in cultural mechanisms as well, and I would love to see more attention paid to the people who are participating in those ways.
I also really believe in those mechanisms. I mean, I've made a career of paying attention to those mechanisms and thinking about them. But I also, again, worry that if we leave it to those mechanisms, that we've missed an opportunity. And so, as I was thinking about how I would answer this question, I was thinking about the importance for all of us of just being informed, paying attention to the signs that are right in front of us, and to paying careful attention to, and maybe actively paying attention to discrimination and equality and how that affects us in every facet of our life. Thank you.
Excuse me, are you taking any questions at some point in time?
We are. We thought we would save them for the end because there are interlinkages between the different topics that are raised. Is that okay?
Well, I guess it's going to have to be.
Okay. All right. I am going to show a very short animation right now by a professor from Western. And let me just tell you a little bit about her so you can understand the context of this animation that she created. Her name is Pasha Barua. She's the Canada Research Chair in Global Women's Issues and a professor in the Department of Women's Studies and Feminist Research at Western. She conducts interdisciplinary research on gender, development, and globalization, women in work, and social, political, and economic inequality. She frequently serves as an expert reviewer, consultant, and advisor to international development and environmental organizations, and she was named to the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars in 2015. So in hearing the sorts of topics that she covers, it won't be a surprise that her research looks also at climate change and social justice. And it's aimed broadly at understanding how to ensure that a global low-carbon economy will be more gender equitable and socially just than one based on fossil fuels. So she's created an animation on this, which I would like to show you, as it's a different way to convey her research to get it out there in a very accessible manner.
Concerns about fossil fuel security and environmental sustainability convinced countries around the world to transition to clean sources of energy. As countries transition to solar, hydro, geothermal, bioenergy, wind, and other sources of clean, renewable energy, not only do they address energy poverty, but they also create new employment opportunities. Although there is a growing concern that these opportunities will be distributed unevenly. Women are already severely underrepresented in both fossil fuel and renewable energy employment, and they will become even more marginalized if gender equality programs are not proactively planned and implemented. Dr. Bipasha Barua at Western University has analyzed occupational patterns for women's employment in clean energy across different countries, and identified successful initiatives that optimize women's participation in the sector. Her findings reveal that there are glaring inequities in employment in renewables, particularly in industrialized countries. The focus in OECD countries has been almost exclusively on the technologies and financing, not on employment policy. Some emerging economies in developing countries, such as China, Brazil, India, South Africa, and Bangladesh, have created much more employment for women in clean energy, but the jobs are poorly paid and precarious. A global transition to low-carbon economies will create 60 million new jobs by 2040, mainly in technology and infrastructure. That potential is worth celebrating, but it is also important not to exaggerate the ability of such employment to reduce gender inequality. With appropriately targeted training, education, apprenticeships, employment placement, financial tools, and supportive social policies, the transition to clean energy may alleviate existing gender inequities and help achieve global human development goals. Women can benefit from clean energy initiatives, particularly if there are wider socially progressive policies in place. Dr. Barua's research enables us to understand not just the technical training, education, and financing that must be in place, but also the employment practices, cultural shifts, and wider social policies that must be implemented and expanded in order to protect workers and spread the employment gains from clean energy more evenly. To learn more, Visit us online.
There's one other.
Canada is transitioning from fossil fuels to clean energy. This has generated significant interest, not only because of the potential impact on the environment, but also because of the new jobs being created. However, there is far too little attention paid to the gender of the people being hired. Women are a minority in the energy sector everywhere in the world, and Canada is no exception. In the past, the federal government has not played an active role in framing and implementing effective policies. Instead, the vast majority of clean energy initiatives in Canada have been driven by the private sector, municipalities, and provincial governments. The federal government's lack of leadership has led to a patchwork of policies at the provincial and municipal levels. The current government has made more explicit commitments to clean energy and to climate change mitigation, but there has been no conversation about employment equity in the transition to sustainable energy. Reports from around the world warn of a looming skills gap as both industrialized and emerging economies retool their existing industries. There are skills shortages that cover a wide range of different occupations, such as engineers, architects, skilled trades, equipment operators, technicians, and construction laborers. Although the skill shortages present challenges for labor supply, they also represent an opportunity to train and recruit women, visible minorities, Aboriginal peoples, new immigrants, and other groups that have historically been marginalized in the energy sector in Canada. A few promising initiatives aimed at training and employing First Nations and inner-city workers in installing clean energy systems and building energy retrofits have emerged recently from collaborations between provincial governments, publicly owned utilities, and social enterprises. However, such initiatives remain rare, and interest in replication in other settings is unclear. Raising awareness about equity issues is urgent and critical. Employment-related reports on the green economy in Canada often do not mention gender equity at all. The rare report that does highlight opportunities to employ underrepresented groups, including women, stops short of calling for the kinds of policy approaches and concrete action required to ensure greater equity. Most future green job creation in Canada will be in occupations in which women are currently underrepresented, such as engineering and the skilled trades. If equity programs are not carefully planned, implemented, and monitored, almost none of the more skilled and better paid technical jobs would go to women. In 2007, women only accounted for 1 to 2% of completions in apprenticeship training in major trade groups. In 2011, women comprised just 23% of engineering graduates aged 25 to 34. Since workers are likely to transition from jobs in the brown economy, which is heavily male-dominated, to the green, women will be fairly represented in green jobs only if gender equity in employment is planned and implemented proactively. To read the full report, visit Vipasha Barua online.
All right, so now I'm just going to turn the lights back on, and I'd like to invite to the table Isaac. So we're going to turn now to a different topic area, but it is related. The environment in southwestern Ontario, current concerns. And I'm going to introduce my colleague Isaac Bugina. He's the Canada Research Chair in Health Geography and is a professor in the Department of Geography at Western. And his research examines the broad determinants of population health and links to the environment, such as examining links between ambient air quality and health in southwestern Ontario, so very locally based research. He's also involved in HIV/AIDS research in Africa, specifically Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria, and he became a member of the College of New Scholars in 2014. So let's start off with the question, can you tell me about the work you've done and are doing in southwestern Ontario?
So I'm going to be using we, because the work I do, you have to do with others. Because environmental health work is very complicated, as you would expect. So I tend to work with, I'm in geography, but I have to work with engineers who can monitor air quality, for instance. And so I'm going to be using we because all of my work has been done with somebody else. So the work we've been doing in southwestern Ontario, first, my background, I did my PhD in Hamilton, and we had looked at the health effects of the Petro-Canada refinery, which was by the QEW, if anybody remembers. They closed down, and when they closed, some people wanted to give us the credit for the work we did. We were literally revealing the health effects that the refinery had in the Oakville and Burlington area, following different series of studies. And so, coming out of that, I started in Windsor, and one day a colleague came up and said, would you consider doing some work in Sarnia? And I joked that Sarnia, I have been out of school just 3 years, and I don't think I'll be the first person recognizing that Sarnia needs some work. But we decided to visit. And I was amazed, as you would expect. I don't know if any of you here is originally from Sarnia. Sarnia has 40% of Canada petrochemical industries located right there, at least historically. Some may have moved as a result of NAFTA. We got in there and I realized this is going to be a little bit of a challenge, because in Oakville we were dealing with Petro-Canada refinery. So we can see this is it. In Sarnia we have a massive amount of different refineries. So right there, we can almost see the answers to our questions. Nobody takes the blame, which is the greatest challenge that everybody is having with them in there. So we cannot point a finger and say it is Sunoco or another plant that is messing up the place. But we started and got local support, and so we started to do some work. We did monitoring with engineers. I got my colleagues who are engineering who can do air quality monitoring. And then we did with our physicians friends, we never did a blood sample or hair sample and stuff like that for all various reasons. But we looked at the air pollution dispersion and several modeling that we did. We monitored air quality, we tried to use dispersion models, we tried to figure out where the pollution is. And immediately what struck me was there's Anjimna Reserve in Sarnia area, if anybody knows about it. When we got in there, we got into Sarnia area to do the work. We did not go in there looking to work in the reserve. But once we started getting our surfaces and results coming back, right away the reserve stood out really strong. So we had to tell the focus. So I put one of my students in there to do his research work. He's now working for Canada Health Protection Agency. And about the same time, a group led by Michael Gilbertson published a report that showed that in the reserve, the ratio of boys to girls was 2:1 for girls. They were no longer having boys. And this happened, if anybody remembered the story, because they couldn't raise baseball teams for boys. So the community was, the reserve people were concerned. And so they decided to track back, and then the numbers basically showed. And our work was revealing almost the same thing, that no way, this is not looking right. And so we got into the reserve, we worked with them quite a bit, wrote some papers, and the papers were Ada, who was always our lead, with us. And we did quite a bit of work there. And then we also found that even in Sarnia, the effects of pollution was gender-based. And at that time, not anybody wrote about pollution and gender. So we got that. One of the students who led that, one of my students is now a professor in Ryerson. So we also found that. And then we found that even in the area, once you put the surfaces all over, the more you are exposed, the less likely you will have a family physician. So you can almost imagine we are talking about equity, social justice. So this is Sanya. We are not talking about, you know, and the more you are exposed, the highly likely you wouldn't have a family physician. And then we went further to say, what exactly is going on here? So we went to Clarke, Canadian Health Information. That's where we have all the Clarke carries all the admissions data sets. I'm bypassing to the storyline. We asked for all hospital admissions in Lundy area, Windsor area, and Sanya area. Our immediate task was to find out, you know, sometimes it's difficult to explain these things without showing somebody the evidence. So using London as our control, we wanted to prove that in the Sanya area, there must be something really bad or elevated, we would call it. So we took the hospital admissions, respiratory, cardiovascular, and once we started comparing London, Windsor, and Sanya, it was so obvious that yes, this is not looking good. The rates were so high, so you control for the population. In the Sanya area, about 80-something thousand, London 350,000. Then you see that Sanya area is producing 4 times as many cardiovascular or respiratory illnesses. You have to know that yes, there's a problem there. So that was what we kept this work, doing this in Sanya, including the reserve in Anjim Nam. We did a lot of writing. We presented this work to the city council. Obviously, there's a challenge there. Everybody will ask, so what happened? The greatest challenge, like I said in the beginning, is the number of refineries we have in the area. You cannot point a finger. And some of them look pretty much funny, that if there's an order, a spill, or somebody's feeling that there's a little bit of a smell, and you call 911, they send a cop. And the cop comes to sniff the air and say, oh, maybe it's from this side. And that's the way they handle it. I was surprised in Canada in the 21st century, you know. But you can see that the industry, the dominance of the industry, literally, simply put, overshadowed common sense to the extent that the philosophically say that when you keep doing the wrong thing over and over and over, it becomes right. So they get away with it because that's the way they do it. And yeah, so not very interesting of a story from that side. What has happened to date? Yeah, they have talked about different mechanisms. The real problem is, from the work we do, the number of refineries we have there and the exposure, government has cracked down in a way, but then we also find that even when sometimes they are nailed for 1 or 2 offenses, nothing happens afterwards. So all those challenges we've written, the follow-up is always a little bit bizarre. The SWAT team comes in, somebody's charged, and then probably in 2 weeks, they literally do the same thing. And moving on, we can ask some questions afterwards. Then we looked at the Windsor area. We, again, given the greatest challenge along the boundary, because of US, sharing border of Canada, it is very difficult to live in and to ask for help. Afterwards, at some point, the government had put in what they call the BACS study, Border Air Quality Strategy, trying to look at that whole corridor and try to understand what was happening. The problem we have always had is because of the Detroit and Ohio Valley area, the air is coming in from all sorts of industries from everywhere else. So it has been very challenging to nail down what cause and effect is in southwestern Ontario. But in Windsor, we did this, especially after 911, when everything came to a stop. Air quality zoomed up until recently. So we were in there, the trucks were stuck, everybody was stuck, and we were looking at respiratory health. And of course, yes, the effects were so high in the area. And so we're monitoring how much air pollution is being produced with this traffic jam. It has improved quite a lot, I must say. I should retract and say overall, air quality in Ontario has been going down. It has been improving overall. But these packets of air quality areas are different stories we are telling. But I don't want to create the impression that it's that bad. Overall, historically, it has been going down. But in the Windsor area, when you have these acute events, then things can get so wrong so quickly. And then, because of 911, the politics of transportation moved in the direction that they knew if anybody has gone there recently, they've contracted this new way, where so many people were relocated. The other thing we try to do is look at the health impact of that new construction. And the same gentleman who was doing work in Sarnia for his master's did that for his PhD. He's working at Rice University, now doing noise monitoring in the Toronto area. Yeah, I've been talking to you.
No, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Have you studied London, or just Windsor and Sarnia are your main focuses?
London, usually when we are talking about this, the reason I'm smiling is one of the jobs we don't want to do is present, how do I say it, scare people without a solution. So when you don't want to, if I have to scare you, I have to tell you, run this way, you'll be safe. So that's why I'm smiling. Yeah, if I were to be blunt, the thing we found in London that was bad is probably not around here, the railways, the CN rail. We looked at the impact, the NO2 emissions. So I was so happy that the city gave out, I don't know how many of you know about BMO Center for the soccer arena. Instead of letting people build around there, and they are still trying to expand it, so I'm just hoping they should do that. It's an arena. Kids go there to play, but they leave. So that one we can deal with it. But the railway corridor, it is the worst exposure spot in London area. So otherwise, London generally is not that bad. But we've looked at the effect of the railways, and most of the work we have done is with Health Canada. So they've compiled all of these works, and they're looking at national studies, trying to look at the effect of exposure on cancer, on mortality. But in London, if I were to say the one thing we picked up, which nobody actually thought about, was the railway. And that is what we've been dealing with. But generally, I wouldn't be, no, I don't want to scare anybody in this room. Actually, my house backed up to the railway somehow. Yeah.
So your research is very local.
Yeah.
So one last question. Given the work that you've been doing, what do you think are some of the current concerns in the region?
The current concerns we have generally in all of our work is to be sure that, like I was just talking about London, that we know what we are doing. It's a huge challenge. So sometimes you find it difficult to blame government as well. Monitoring these exposures is very difficult because you all know, I teach health geography, and I tell the students when they come in, we have what we call time geography. I will ask the students, since you woke up this morning, probably your first class was 8:30, tell me where you have been until you came to my class around maybe 12 in the afternoon. And they are sitting there like, oh my goodness, I'll be here. The same with exposure. So it's so difficult to pin down these exposure issues. Even with we study disease spread, if there's SARS, we try to model where SARS is spreading through. How do we know where the first person got it? It was like Ebola. If you go to the web and you try to find out where was the first Ebola case in Guinea and Liberia, it's a toss-up. And up to now, they say patient 0. How exactly can you decide that this person was patient 0? Those are the challenges we keep having. We are currently doing some work on breast cancer clustering. And we just submitted more than $500,000 request for money to do what some people may find to be, if you are not careful, you will think that it's a waste of time. But we want to go back in history and find out, can we track these clusters? We can find the clusters. Can we historically determine, was there something that we didn't know in particular places, or was there a particular exposure that is driving it that we still don't know? Those are the challenges we are having. So the greatest challenge we have is nailing down exactly this is it. That's it. Otherwise, with our cancer work, we are hoping, if the government is willing to fund, we hope they will. So we will go through the whole of Ontario, look for these clusters, and now literally go in there and find out historically what was located here, what people work on. Then, of course, the family history is always there, and how can we bring this to the surface and try to understand, because we all know that we technically say probably 30% of breast cancer causes can be explained. The other 70, nobody knows. So we are trying to find out, can we use history? Now going back in history to determine whether we can understand some of the exposure issues. Those are the new tools, but it's challenging.
To try and explain the other 70%.
To try and explain the other 70%, yeah.
Wow, so rather large challenges in your research.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right, good.
All right. I'm going to put up a PowerPoint now and invite T and Kelly to come up. Oh, you're right.
Stand here and talk. Is that all right? Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. My name is T, and I'm pleased to be here with one of my research collaborators, Kelly Wood, and Sarah Bassett usually is here too. Our research is completely different from the previous presentation. What we look at is family photography. And while most of you have a sense of what family photos are, in fact, you're all experts of your own family photos, we started off with a set of questions. What are our families, and what are family photos, and what can they tell us about the world in which we live? So family photography is the most conventional genres, often attesting to lofty aspirations, yet seldom lingering in the depths of disappointment. This is because our world is so visually saturated. We know how to present ourselves for the camera, having internalized expectations about how to pose. These expectations conjure a familiar set of images. Smiles on graduation day, convocation just happened. Grins on birthdays, joy at weddings, bliss at the birth of a child. Never mind that most of us kind of at some wedding might have thought they're not going to last. You didn't get the gift that you wanted at Christmas, and so on. So these are all of these occasions emphasize positive themes of unity, mobility, prosperity, and futurity. Such themes appear so trite, banal, and nostalgic that critics rarely discuss family photography. And on the occasions that they do, they consider the genre to be trivial or dismiss them outright, contending that conventional representations tend to reify ideological conventions. They reproduce, for example, gender, class, and race. And yet our emotional attachment to these objects remains enduring. We feel for them despite knowing that this is not the truth about ourselves. So despite the apparent ubiquity of family photography, we're just beginning to glimpse the fullness of the meanings. How does the making of family photographs shape the idea of family? In what context do family photographs circulate, and how do the meanings of these artifacts shift during this process of circulation? And in cases where groups do not have family photographs, what is the impact of this absence? So answering these questions has been a difficult task, in large part because, as Karen Strasso, the anthropologist, notes, detached from the people who animate them with sentiment, photographs remain incomplete objects. In our existing archives right now, for example, mainstream institutions, very rarely are these artifacts labeled as family photographs, and when they do collect family photographs, they are often in the form of orphaned images that lack any kind of contextual information. Community, I mean, we're not the only project that works with family photographs, but community organizations do not have the capacity to preserve them long term, and they often don't collect them with the stories as well. So the Family Camera Network is a collaborative research project funded by a 3-year Short Partnership Development Grant. grant. And people like Kelly Wood, Sarah Bassnett, also at Western University, and 25 other collaborators and 6 partners have been involved in this project to collect and preserve family photographs and their stories. 2 of the most prominent organizations are the Royal Ontario Museum and the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. And so what we've been doing is collecting these albums that sometimes appear, you know, it's interesting where they're stored. Fortunately, there is no litter in there. We collect them and we preserve them. And it's not just analog photos that we're collecting and preserving. We've entered the digital age, and so it's born digital artifacts that we're also including, and we're developing best practices for archiving these materials. We thought, again, we know that we're not the only project that does this. We thought that somebody else already had a template for doing it. No, they don't. We had to consult with lawyers to develop a methodology for this, and it's been instructive, exhausting, but very instructive along the way. So together, we are producing a public archive of family photographs that offer a resource to shed new light on Canada's transnational histories. And much of this is driven by an anti-racist commitment. It stems from our belief that mainstream archives don't yet contain materials that can help elucidate the experiences of marginalized groups. And in my own case, in another project that I'm working on, in the history of the war in Vietnam, from the perspective of Vietnamese photographers, I've had difficulty in, for example, the US archives, which only generally shed light on the American experience. And when it comes to doing my research in Vietnam, I get plenty of glimpses into kind of the winning side, but not the side that lost. And so my hunch, many years ago when I started to do that particular project, my hunch was I would find the perspective of the losing side by looking at the personal collections of the diaspora. And so I started to look at family photos, and then some of my colleagues were interested in something very similar with a focus on different kinds of communities, and that's how we got together to do the Family Camera Network. So we partnered with mainstream organizations, specifically the Royal Ontario Museum, in order to transform the existing structure. Historically, as some of you may know, the ROM has had kind of a fraught relationship with marginalized communities, and this is kind of our, I guess, faith or belief that institutions can be changed from within. So this is part of what we've been doing. We proceed with a conviction also. So this is some of the workshops that we've held. We proceed with the conviction that there are multi-sensory dimensions to family photography, and that the one that we are most accustomed to, the visual, is just one of many others. There's the haptic, the ways in which we touch family photography, and the haptic activates kind of our affective dimension, the feeling that we have for it, and then the sonic, which is the oral dimension. So this leads us to our methodology. We collect family photos along with oral histories, and so our methodology brings together the two fields of photography studies and oral history. And so Kelly's going to come up to talk a little bit more about our methodology.
Can I sit?
Yeah, you can sit, because sorry.
Thanks, Dee.
Go for it.
So I'm on the digital archive team, and it's my role as a visual artist to try to do the kind of production and to putting the systems all together. And one of the things that this particular project tries to do, which is unusual for an oral history, is to add the kind of haptic, the touch dimension to the project. And I think this is important in this case because these emotional touch connections are usually the ways in which people have interacted with the particular cultural object in the first place. These photos, these albums were made by hand, they were assembled by hand, they're cared for by hands, and they are referred to with the hand gestures when the interviews and the oral history is being kind of laid out for us. So, and we specifically have the term to be handed down as part of a kind of an oral history tradition, and it also, you know, the hand is very important to this particular type of artifact. So the hand gestures and the touch connections were the particular job of camera B. So we have camera A, which focuses on the face and the telling of the story of the storyteller, and then we have a camera B, which is looking at the pointing and referring to specific events and those kinds of things. And I think this was a challenge for us, in that the main thing that you want to happen when you are interviewing a person is you want their comfort to be at the highest level it could possibly be. And with 2 cameras and a lot of lights and these kind of systems interfering, I think that was our biggest challenge. In addition to the kinds of things where things kind of go off frame and go astray. But we're trying to work with them, and so what happens when we get these 2 camera outputs is we're stitching them together, syncing them up, and we're adding also the audio synced as well, so you would have the 2 kinds of ways of telling to be visible for future generations, for archivists. And it's the kind of, so in many cases, this kind of record preserves a continuity of family history that may have been disrupted over time. It's a specific history, it's a private history, it's the kind of untold story of, not the grand narrative, these are the kind of stories where you're kind of collecting what has happened to the individual people that have been part of this big grand narrative. And it's, you know, contributing to an alternate kind of history wherein you have specific actors talking about very, very specific instances and ways in which this book itself has traveled across borders through different situations has also become a little bit part of the narrative too. So that the hand-to-hand mailing, sending, taking this artifact across borders through disrupting situations of families has also been part of that hand story.
I was trying to show you the event montage, but we've had a little technical glitch.
Technical difficulties?
Yes, so camera A on the participant, camera B on the photos, and Kelly's been supervising a graduate student at Western in post-production to suture the footage together so that you would have a permanent record of the interview, the story about the photos together. So public engagement is a vital part of this project, and the creation of this public archive entails working closely with the public. Our participants collaborate with us in the building of this archive. We've drawn largely from this public archive in turn to produce another major outcome this past year, the Family Camera exhibit at the Royal Ontario Museum and the Art Gallery in Mississauga. And if you're free tomorrow is the last day of the show at the Royal Ontario Museum. It opened as part of Contact as a primary show on May 6th, and closes tomorrow. Thus far, we've had 85,000 visitors, which my academic book had maybe 6 readers. So it's an interesting way of, I guess, engaging with the public and telling a different story. I very much viewed kind of the curation of this show as kind of making an argument about the historical importance of family photography in a completely different format. So this show was part of Ron's sesquicentennial programming, and the overarching theme of the show was how photography mediates experiences of migration. What was really revealing for us was that all of the photos in the show are Canadian photos, but their origins were often somewhere else. We borrowed objects, we drew from the material that we collected, and we also invited 2 artists, Deanna Bowen, whose specialty is the Black diaspora, as well as Jeff Thomas, who's worked extensively on kind of his own family narratives in his artwork. So here you can see you enter through a mirrored hallway, and we had to work with a very challenging space. This kind of, I was listening to the head curator, my colleague here, Polly Dewan, talk about this space, and she said, you know, this is what you have to do to enter this gallery. It's 7,500 square feet. You go through this tunnel, and she did not want the feel of a tunnel because it was a little too room-like for her, and she didn't want to, you know, get into this overdeveloped metaphor. And so we thought of mirroring this hallway to prompt reflection, or actually self-reflection, on the ways in which we constantly look at ourselves and our world through cameras. So we made use of this very unusual and somewhat challenging space. It's been, so one of the components of the show is the history of the personal cameras that we've all had access to, and this is quite different from the very expensive cameras of the studio. It was really, what we're looking at is modest objects, or trivial objects, and elevating them to greater historical significance. So this was a popular aspect of the show, as was this wall, which you can't see very closely. This part of the show was co-curated, or actually curated by Sarah Bassett, who's in the Department of Visual Arts. This was the Niagara Falls wall, and it's hung in salon style, and it features photographs of Canadians at Niagara Falls. A prominent landmark in kind of this part of Canada, of Ontario, and kind of a rite of passage for any tourist and any new Canadian, usually, to come and photograph themselves in relationship to this national landmark. So it's really an investigation of how these visual rites of passage enable us to establish a connection to the land in which we live. The part of the show that I curated was the state of the family. Now, I was interested in how the state has produced definitions of family in order to regulate and normalize policies, some of which are actually forms of violence, particularly when it comes to immigration and assimilation. Who counts as family and is afforded the rights of this designation and recognition. So photography plays a key role in this task. And perhaps no better example than, of this appears than in the Indian residential school system, which, as you know, is where Indigenous children were taken away from their parents and kept at schools where they were prevented from speaking their own languages and from seeing their own families. And it's recently been described as a form of cultural genocide. So in curating this part of the show, I did not anticipate how much Decolonized Canada 150 would take up. I was more concerned, I was definitely committed to thinking about kind of how the state sees family, and then how families look back at the state and try to redefine themselves. But this part of the show posed a challenge, not just in terms of material. There are thousands of photographs that exist of the Indian residential school system, but the problem is they are taken by the state and its collaborators, the churches. And scholars, such as my colleague in the English department, Pauline Wakeham, have described these objects as atrocity images made by their perpetrators. So my preliminary research showed the extent of this discursive violence. Few, if any, of the children in these photographs are named, unlike the church administrators who always receive a name. And in some cases, the captions describe the church administrators as the mother of these children. So there's a discourse of family that's happening at the top, from the top down. So in this way, the state and its surrogates appropriated family as a structure that assimilated Indigenous children. So in this part of the show, I did not want to perpetuate this visual violence by reifying the perspective of the state. So instead, I was really inspired when I came across this set of photographs taken by Beverly Brown when she was a student at St. Mike's Residential School in British Columbia. Her father had been a student there himself and knew too well the isolation and loneliness of this experience. He gifted her with a camera and supplied her with film and ensured that her pictures would be printed. For years they were stored. She eventually stored them in the basement, did not talk about them, no one saw them, until her daughter found them and donated them to UBC's Museum of Anthropology. They are a record, you can sort of see here, they are a record of resilience. And I would say the chosen family that Indigenous children made when they were at the school. So when the MOA put up an exhibit of Beverly Brown's work a few years ago, they blew up one of these group shots and invited visitors to identify the students. And they subsequently did so. And what was notable to me, and we don't really see that here, is that the supervisor is not named, it's just teacher. Right? So it's a reversal of the usual kind of archival identification. So I want to close by talking briefly about the intersections between public and private spheres. The state definitions are reinforced through production of what's called instrumental photography for the purposes of identification and surveillance. But I think this is only half of the story. So this part of the exhibit, State of Family, attends to the ways that marginalized subjects repurpose photos made of them for their own ends. So consider the example of Ray Lum's father, Tommy Lum, who appears in this state document that's effectively the head tax certificate. He arrived in Canada as a laborer subject to prevailing exclusion laws that targeted him, that targeted Chinese men like him. He was required to pay a punishing $200 head tax at that time, 2 years' wages. Such laws targeted men of Chinese descent and were meant to ensure that Canada remained a predominantly white nation. He would have taken this photo, he did take this photo at a studio in Hong Kong, and duplicates were made, and they appeared on different transit passages. And we show this at the exhibit. And yet these documents are also the earliest photos that Ray has of his father. These are not just state documents, these are family photos. They attest to a different perspective in the Lum family. One that is full of filial love and attachment that exceeds the grasp of the state. So the exclusion laws also prevented Chinese men from immigrating to Canada and produced, or tried to restrict the numbers, and they produced a phenomenon, a so-called phenomenon of bachelor husbands. They were not allowed to bring back the wives that they had married in China. So Tommy was separated for a decade from his wife Irene, whom he married in China. And like other Chinese Canadians, Ray's parents found a way around these laws. They purchased an identity documents from a family who had lost a daughter around Irene's age. And she eventually came to Canada to reunite with her husband, actually to marry her husband for the first time for Canadian purposes. She came as a paper daughter, and this is her in the double-breasted coat. So this is a family photo, a reunion photo, but what's very odd about it, and this is why kind of the visual dimension of family photos is only one register of the meaning of the family photo. It looks like just any kind of family photo, but this is an odd reunion. This is one of the first times that she's ever met her paper family, and they were effectively strangers to her. We've continued with activations of this exhibition through partnerships with the City of Toronto as part of Nuit Blanche that took place on September 30th in 2017. And this was at Union Station, where some of the photos that we have collected have been blown up. I should just add too that as we are trying to complicate our definitions of family, a key component of this project comes by way of our partner, the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. And they're very much committed to looking at chosen families. So you can see the queering of family here. So in these ways, our research provides a way of understanding marginalized subjects in the subversive manner with which they have grappled with the state. The family photographs and their stories present for us a counter-archive to trace Canada's transnational histories.
Now, I neglected to introduce T and Kelly, so I'm going to now kind of close their talk by telling you a little bit about them. T. Fu is an associate professor whose research focuses on photography, race, and Asian diasporas. Her books include a monograph titled Picturing Model Citizens, Civility in Asian American Visual Culture, and a co-edited volume called Feeling Photography. Currently, she's working on 2 projects, one of which she mentioned, Warring Visions, a book that offers a new visual history of the war in Vietnam by exploring the contributions of Vietnamese photographers, and the Family Camera Network, a collaborative public archive of family photos and their stories, which you've just heard all about. And she became a member of the College of New Scholars in 2016. And Kelly Wood is a photographer and practicing artist whose research focuses on subjects that relate to the environmental impact of waste accumulation, waste economies, and all forms of visible and invisible pollution. Her most well-known work is the Continuous Garbage Project from 1998 to 2003, which was an exhaustive photographic archive of all the garbage produced by the artist over a 5-year period. And I had heard about that because I think you were interviewed on I don't know, the radio or something. It's quite fascinating. So thank you very much. That was really very, very interesting. So our last presentation, our last kind of discussion today is on the topic of mobilizing knowledge for wicked problems, research for policy and practice in family violence. And I'm going to be speaking with Nadine Wilson. She's a full professor at the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western, with affiliations in nursing and women's studies and feminist research. She's also a research scholar at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. Her research examines the health and social service sector response to violence against women and children, interventions to reduce health inequities, and the science of knowledge translation. She's passionate about finding a way to enhance the use of research in policy and practice, and she joined the College of New Scholars in 2015. So, we've heard a lot from our previous speakers about the importance of doing research in different areas of social justice. Nadine, I'd like to discuss the issue of how to mobilize that research knowledge, how to get it out into the hands of those who can use it in policy and practice in the public sphere. Now, as you've all heard, Nadine calls these problems wicked problems. Can you tell us why? What is that all about?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Valerie. And I guess I just want to start, I was just reflecting on the pros and cons of going last. I'm just thinking about the amazing presentations, and my mind is sort of buzzing with you know, the links between our work. I think the downside is that I have to live up to that standard, so I will do my best. So, you know, we call these wicked problems, and it's interesting because as I was listening to our colleagues, I was thinking about the different levels of problems and the way problems are identified. And you can go from fairly simple problems, which doesn't mean they're easy to solve, but it might mean that the inputs and outputs are fairly stable and predictable and understandable. They get more complicated when, you know, there are more moving parts, but usually the nature of the problem itself stays stable. And then Isaac mentioned that the problems he works on are complicated because there are many moving pieces around the solution. They happen at multiple levels and so on, but still the nature of the problem, the impact of pollution on human health, is a relatively stable problem. I think in the area I work in, which I would broadly categorize as trauma, mental health, and violence, you get into that level of wickedness, which basically means that there are multiple levels of the problem and they're interrelated with other really complex problems. And that's where it gets really difficult because you're chasing the problem around. So I wanted to give a couple of examples in the area of family violence. And I define family violence primarily as violence against women and children in the context of the home, recognizing that we're learning more about men's experiences of violence, and that's an important area where we need more research. But if you think about even things like risk indicators, I'm not keen on the term risk factors, but let's say risk indicators for violence. We know that there are individual level factors. We know, for example, gender obviously is a major individual level factor related to experiencing violence, and certainly sexual identity, sexual orientation is another. But there are also relationship level factors. So you can bring in things like alcohol and drug misuse in the relationship, especially by the perpetrator, or financial strain, the loss of a job, that sort of thing. That certainly can start to add stress in a relationship and get at that level of factor. Then there are community level issues or indicators. So the more violence there is in the community, the fewer supports, the more impactful violence can be and the more prevalent that it might be. And then we go out to social structures, and that includes everything from, social norms and who has power and who doesn't have power, and we've talked about those themes a little bit today. And really the notion of personhood. So, I think in many ways it's at that level that we'll start to get some of the solutions. But if women and children are inherently seen as less human or subordinate, they will be victims of violence, and we see that over and over again. At the structural level, we also have policies that are themselves harmful, and we've heard about structural violence, as T just mentioned. So, I think the wickedness of the problem is that it's happening at these multiple levels. So where do you situate the solution? For family violence, you also add an intergenerational factor. So you have, we live what we learn. If you grow up in a household with a lot of violence, you're more likely to both perpetrate and or be a victim of violence when you're an adult. So there's that intergenerational component, and the impacts of those traumas happen across the lifespan as well. And then you add things like your social identity, whether it's gender or sexual minority status, disability, poverty. So you start to appreciate the wickedness of the problem and this notion of sort of chasing that problem around as you try to implement solutions. So one example I often think of is I've worked a lot with women's shelters in Ontario, and just trying to even help them explain what it is they do, so that funders don't keep asking them to report on things that they don't do, which takes a lot of time and effort. The structural problem with women escaping violence is we don't have affordable housing. So those are choices that we make as a society to, maybe privilege some types of housing and development over other sorts of housing and development. So shelters are a stopgap at the individual level. They will certainly help women and their children when they're in a crisis. But if that woman has nowhere to go, and the policy is you've got, maybe 3-4 weeks at the shelter, all those shelters will do whatever they can to keep women there a little bit longer. And then maybe there's transition housing, but then what? If you actually have no realistic choices, then you go back to the relationship, especially if you've got children and you need to make sure that they're housed. So I guess that is how I get to the notion of a wicked problem, that we have what looks like a solution at one level, but it's actually exacerbated by a problem that moves around at other levels, if that makes sense to people.
It does.
Okay.
It does, and it's very complex. Can you tell us a bit about what you're doing right now?
Okay, so, and I'm reflecting on what Joe said right at the beginning. How do we make people care? And we talked a little bit about making sure that people are aware, giving knowledge and awareness, and maybe sort of getting people sensitized to some of these issues. But then I also think there's a piece around action. And I'm going to just place mark a little question for our first panelist, for Cheryl and Joe. How do we be good bystanders and allies in all of this work? So I'll just sort of put that out there to think about. So right now, the thing that keeps me awake at 3 in the morning, or that starts to preoccupy me when menopause wakes me up at 3 in the morning, is what we call the Vega Project, which stands for Violence, Evidence, Guidance, and Action. So we're developing practical, sort of practice-focused, hands-on guidance, and then foundational curriculum for health and social service providers. So at the point of care, in that moment, they know what to do. Okay? And I think in some ways it seems, wow, it's going to be really difficult to do the action piece. How do we get people to change their behaviors, especially in such a big, wicked problem? But when we talk to providers, basically they say, just give us some tools. Just tell us how to do it. Tell us how to ask questions, when to ask questions, how to make sure we're not asking them the wrong way because we don't want to do more harm, and give us scripts. So actually some of the solutions are fairly simple when you think of the complexity of the problem. So that sort of cheers me up. After I get over the fact that we've got these big wicked problems to deal with, we can actually start to think about simple solutions. And I just want to mention a few things about the Vega Project, which is funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. So it's directed by policy actors in public health. And I think one of the neat innovations is that it integrates the ongoing feedback of 22 national organizations that represent a range of health and social service providers. So we have, many groups of physicians, including the group that accredits physician education, specialist education and family practice education, 2 different groups there. We have dental hygienists and dentists, social workers, psychologists, the shelter sector. So really, a broad range. Not every single one, I would say. In hindsight, the former health minister put together this group, which is probably why they came, because if Nadine Wathen says, can you come to this meeting, most of the groups would say no. So you do sort of need that policy piece. And not all were included. So I would think, in the future, how do we get physiotherapists engaged, for example? That's something that we'll need to do, because obviously that would be an important link. But 22 organizations are co-creating this knowledge with us. And I think that is what will maximize the opportunity for uptake and impact, because we're doing it with them and for them. And that's really important. A second, what I would call innovation. I'm hesitant about the word innovation. I think it's sometimes a little bit overused. But we're using serious gaming technology as a mode of delivery of knowledge. So you can have people, whatever their professional background, interact in a safe place with a scenario. And if they make mistakes, nobody's going to go home and have a really bad outcome because of a mistake that they've made clinically. So they can make the mistake, go back, play the game again, and really integrate some of the key things they need to know. So to get the knowledge, start shifting the attitudes, and then give them the practice skills, those actual competencies that they need. So that gaming technology, working with the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo, took me a while to get around the word game and violence, but gamification or interactive technologies, whatever you want to call it. The third thing, I think, and to me, might be the most important shift in thinking, is an approach to care that we're calling trauma and violence-informed care. How many people have heard of trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed care? Have you heard it with the V in there before? So I think that's the innovation, because that V does a lot of work. What the V does is bring in all the wickedness that I just described, the structural violence in particular. So understanding that we've got historical forms of racism and discrimination that impact whether a person even wants to go into a healthcare setting. Okay? Understanding that somebody who's had a lot of abuse in a dental chair is going to have a very different visceral reaction to having an object put in their mouth than someone who hasn't. So just bringing that awareness of multiple forms of trauma and violence that happen across the lifespan, and that make it, I always think of how brave people are to go to healthcare when they've had these multiple cumulative forms of complex trauma, to actually put yourself out there, especially if you're racialized and you've been treated poorly, which many people have in that situation, to go back and get care. So how do we shift the focus onto the provider, but also the organization, to make that space physically safe? Obviously, we don't want to be disclosing, having conversations about abuse if the perpetrator is nearby, but also emotionally safe and culturally safe. And I think that's a huge innovation in this work. And the groups, the 22 organizations, are with us. Sometimes we can't use the word structural violence, that's a little off-putting, but we have worked with them to find ways to describe that. And actually the video whiteboards that Bipasha shared with us, that's one of the tools that we'll be using to explain the core concepts of trauma and violence-informed care. And how do we turn it around to help the provider see the benefit to them as well? Because we all sort of work, we're busy, we're overwhelmed. So, if this is a way to understand what providers often call difficult patients and give better care, and actually have that person leave saying, wow, that was the best interaction I've ever had with that doctor, is not a good thing for everyone. And I think it also reduces the vicarious trauma and the compassion fatigue that providers themselves feel, especially when they're working with highly marginalized populations. So those are some of the innovations in Vega that that we're trying to bring to bear to actually shift this, because there are a lot of curricula out there around family violence, and we're hoping that this one actually is not just one that sits on a shelf.
So you talked a little bit about all of this already, but what have you learned from this project about mobilizing knowledge for these kinds of problems? How do you best get them out there?
Yeah, and this is sort of accumulated mistakes over the course of years, right? And these different ways to share knowledge. I think, I was going to share 3 lessons learned, but now I'm going to share 4. And we have international networks as well. Vega falls under another research network we call PREVAIL, which is Preventing Violence Across the Lifespan. I really like acronyms. It's sort of one of my specialties, I think, but the first is to understand that the real world is messy. Okay, so whether you're in a policy context where you're trying to juggle, research evidence that's being shot at you in multiple ways, as well as values and public outcries and resource constraints, or you're a provider who's got to get patients in and out in 6 minutes because you live in a fee-for-service world and you're not going to be able to pay the bills and your medical office assistant and so on unless you get those people through the door, that it's messy. Okay, so I think that's the first thing. I think the messiness means that we need more forms of knowledge, and we can't expect as researchers that our evidence or research-based empirical data and knowledge is going to be any more important than any of those other forms of knowledge, including tacit knowledge. And that means that, I've done this for years and I actually know what works for this particular person in this moment. And we have to find ways to certainly respect those different forms of knowledge, but to bring it all to the table because the problems are so wicked, right? So that's the first one. So to do this, I wrote a paper a number of years ago called Talk, Trust, and Time. So the 3 T's. If you do this work, it has to be in partnership. And that's why I see sort of Vega as the culmination of other projects that have involved partnership, and the projects we've heard about today certainly are involved in partnership. But that means you have to talk to each other. You have to develop the trust. And that doesn't just happen by teleconference or email. There has to be a face-to-face component. And they have to know that when they call you and say, drop everything, the minister is doing a speech tomorrow on family violence and I need everything you've got. You're like, well, I was going to write a paper today. You do what your policy partner has asked because that's the nature of a trusting bilateral relationship. And then time. It all takes time. And I think that leads to the third point. We're not all, well, first of all, we're not trained in the academy to necessarily do this. So T described, you found a way to talk about the important parts of your research through the show that it was put on at Wrong. It was a way for you to get your messages out. Bapasha showed us ways that she's getting her messages out. But it's not something we're trained for. It's not something we're actually incentivized for. So to get to brass tacks, in a publish or perish world, this is not, when I first started, there wasn't even room for this on my CV. Where do I put a policy brief that I spent a day writing, for somebody at the Public Health Agency of Canada? There's no space for that. So, we've got an increasing imperative to demonstrate impact, and this is in the applied world. I can't imagine what it's like for a 14th century historian to demonstrate, value for money as a public good and this impact stuff. But, there's no time. It's invisible work, as much of this work often is, and it doesn't go anywhere on our CVs. So we have to come up with partnerships, put them in our research grants, but there's actually, they haven't fully structured the academy yet to account for this work. And some of us, I think, just make a decision that we have to do it because, we've got stuff that is actually pretty important and we want to share it. And I guess the final theme, and it came up in everybody's talk today, is disruption. That we will have to disrupt, but I think we also, because people need to be made uncomfortable around these issues if there's going to be change. But we have to respect the fact, and I've been in rooms where I've said things like, look, there's no evidence that routine screening for violence against women does any good. Can we stop digging around for disclosures? Can we think of a better way to have those conversations? I've been screening for years. And if you approach it a certain way, you get a very defensive reaction and it's hard to have a conversation. So I think we need to understand that disruption means giving people time and space to have that cognitive dissonance, to come back to you for another conversation. And again, it takes time to develop trust in that process. So I think disruption is one of my favorite themes these days, and it might be a short-term pain for long-term gain thing, but it will be necessary for these big, difficult problems that people don't want to talk about. So those were the themes I wanted to share, but I also thought it would be fair play to ask Valerie to talk a little bit about what she does, because she's done a wonderful job moderating. But she works in the space as a scholar of law in international human rights and violence against women. So I'm going to put you on the spot.
Sure. Well, one of the comments that you made really struck me, which is that the real world is messy, and that there are multiple levels to problems, and that they are interrelated. And in my work, which has to do with the prosecution of gender-based crimes in international criminal tribunals, I do see this, and let me give you an example. One is an assumption by almost everyone that if someone is appointed to be a judge at one of these really august international criminal tribunals, that they're well-trained and that they are neutral. And that is not always the case, because I'll give you a negative example. There are positive examples, and I'll come to that in a minute. But in a negative example, in one of the courts that I studied, two of the judges came to the table with biases against women. So they had, because of their past and because of cultural upbringing and what's acceptable, what is... So rape myths here in Canada have been identified in various cases, but rape myths in their countries are simply accepted as fact. So in an international criminal tribunal, we had a case where women wanted to talk about the interconnectedness of all of the violence that they faced. And they had all sorts of violence. So, for example, they and their families were captured by rebels, and they were in a war context, and then the women were separated out, they were raped in public, and their children were killed, and their husbands were taken away to be porters and forced to be soldiers. So many different things happening to them, and they want to talk about all of that because that's their experience, and they have many harms that have been done to them. But because of the way that the court system is set up, there are charges for specific things. And the judges decided that they were not going to listen to any evidence that had to do with sexual violence, because they felt that well, they had decided they wanted to exclude those charges, and they felt that any evidence of sexual violence would taint their minds because they had the views that they already held. So the women were trying to tell their stories, and they're saying this happened and this happened, and then sexual violence happened. They say, oh, stop, we're going to not allow you to tell that part of the story, and they would literally cut it out of the transcript, which doesn't happen in any other international tribunal. In other international tribunals, you tell your whole story, and if that particular charge, if that particular violence is not part of the charges, then it doesn't weigh anything. It doesn't prove any particular crime. It's just part of the context. But they had literally sliced the transcript and cut out those pieces. So in the end, when they reconstructed this and did their judgment, they told the stories of these women, but there are these gaps. So they would say, and then she was taken to here, and then this thing happened to her family. And they were so appalled because they said, that's not my story, and the reason I came to the court is to tell my story and get accountability for the crimes that happened to me. So it's complex because it goes to something very fundamental, which is how do you choose your judges? How do you ensure that your judges are well trained? On the positive side, in terms of solutions, there are ways to get at the complexities of all of this. One is to always allow the evidence in. And then weigh it later. You know, does that weigh, if it's not credible, then it weighs nothing. If it is credible, then it weighs more. And the International Criminal Court has done a good job. The prosecution office has adopted a policy paper on how to prosecute sexual and gender-based crimes. And it's very detailed, it's very prescriptive. It tells everyone in the office all of the steps they need to do. So like your Vega project, it identifies all of the different steps. And that has been a sea change, because even those who are not trained in sexual and gender-based violence can just really follow the policy and ask questions of those around them who are trained in this area to ensure that they're aware of how to do things. So there are solutions. But it took some time to get there and many mistakes. So that brings us to the end of our presentation part, but it does bring us to the beginning of our question and answer period, and I would like to invite Joanna to come up as the moderator of the question and answer
Can I
period.
invite, you stay put,
Oh, yes.
invite all the other presenters to come up as well. Okay, so, well, T and you should come too. Okay. T is coming. Let me ask Paul, I think you had a question that you wanted to ask.
Thank you.
First off.
Well, in the spirit of being disruptive, I have a question for Joanna and Cheryl. Your presentation dealt with reconciliation as the underlying theme. If I were to use the word dog, cat, or apple pie, we'd immediately have an image in our mind of what I was talking about. It may vary a little, but we generally know what a dog, cat, or apple pie would look like. I wonder, however, if there is any comparable understanding of a normative definition of reconciliation. What does it really mean? When I say reconciliation, do I mean dog, cat, or apple pie, or something else? It seems to me, and pardon me if it sounds a little bit like a speech, that the Crown, the Indigenous communities, and the courts are all attacking this differently. And the second part of the question, which is connected to it, if I may, is much of your presentation, or some of your presentation, dealt with process and mechanisms. And I wonder if that might not be, to be disruptive, a challenging or perhaps even incorrect way of addressing the problem, in the sense that I think that the Crown and the judicial system very much like mechanisms and processes. They like a transactional view of an issue. You know, murdered and missing women, did that, check it off. Truth and Reconciliation, did that, check it off, and all that kind of stuff. My sense, however, is that the Indigenous population have a much different view of life, and that you don't achieve reconciliation, however that may be determined, by simply picking things done off a checklist. I think back to the notion of the Turo Wampum, and it doesn't talk about transaction, it talks about going together. So I apologize for the speech, but buried in there is a question, do you understand, or do we understand what reconciliation means, and are mechanisms and processes really the way of going at it? That was a long question.
I would like to be a judicious moderator and turn it over to Cheryl, but she's pointing at me.
Well, I think with respect, I think that's part of the issue, is that if we ask 2, 4, 6 of you to sit down on a piece of paper in 25 words or less, say, define reconciliation, we're going to get 7 different answers.
Well, that was going to be part of my answer. You know, Paul, I think that I edited a book called Reconciliations, 13 authors, 13 different definitions
Yes.
of the word reconciliation. And there are a number of people in the room who work on these kinds of questions. We all have different ideas. The transitional justice literature has identified reconciliation as happening at different levels. There's interpersonal reconciliation that needs to happen maybe between me and you if I have wronged you. There's social levels of reconciliation. There's political reconciliation. There's reconciliation from the state to the victim. There's reconciliation at the international level, and so on. So I think it's a big question, and I'm sorry I can't give you a real answer, except to say that I think we're still getting there. I had a conversation once with a colleague, Fanny Dutoy, who was the executive director of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town. And he said to me, I know you keep thinking of it as social cohesion. And I said, yes. I said, I think reconciliation is people being able to live together again. And he said, yes, but. And there are loads and loads of answers that could come from that. Cheryl, I'm going to turn it over to you. You thought you were off the hook. Do you want to talk about the institutional part, maybe? Or not?
To be fair, I did look up the idea of reconciliation in the 2 reports from the GRC. They have 4, I think 4 or 6 are posted now, and I think one of the shorthand definitions was an idea, a concept of living together with dignity and respect and mutuality between among peoples, between and among peoples.
Sorry, I would agree with that as a definition.
I think in some ways, you know, this answer is going to be, I think, disappointing because it sounds as if I'm dodging your question, but I'm not meaning to. I think asking about reconciliation implies we know what our problems are. And I think in many cases that's really not a fair assumption to make. when Indigenous peoples haven't been permitted to define the terms by which the problem is understood, and they haven't been permitted to define the terms and the means by which it will be resolved. And so, in many ways, watching the government move towards different commissions, watching them make more departments, watch them proliferate, the means by which something is understood is always to move into a kind of pluralism that isn't about the plurality of Indigenous perspectives or voices. And so the government keeps generating ideas in its own agenda. And I think what it's missed is an opportunity to understand that the long history of Indigenous peoples, speaking at different moments, the Royal Commission in 1996 and prior to that time, at every moment when they've had an opportunity to speak to the government, and they have raised the issue of residential schools and the impact of those on their communities, how can that voice have been heard so many times and ignored so many times and continue to be ignored in the way that it is being ignored for another purpose? And I think we've missed out on an opportunity to understand that we're looking at someone else's agenda. We're not looking at Indigenous people's agendas. We're not looking at survivors' agendas. We're not looking at the victims' agendas. We're not asking them what it is that they want. We're not asking them to frame the problem. We're not asking them to help us to understand the condition by which these kinds of harms occurred. And to my mind, the great thinker in this regard is Albert Memmi's The Colonizer and the Colonized. He says that, you know, you have to actually read these reports and understand that at every moment when these initiatives take place, someone's agenda is being presented to you and someone's goals are being presented to you, and they're not the goals and they're not the agenda, they're not the will of the victim. And because we don't adopt a victim-centered approach, we take a state-centered approach, we're actually not understanding the problem, and therefore how can we begin to address or conceptualize something like reconciliation?
Thank you. To my view, though, that speaks to, and I apologize, you got me, but you know me from school. It speaks to your point, and the media and everybody else talks about and throws the word reconciliation around, although it was a homogeneous term that it covered all of these various aspects, everything that we're talking about, which absolutely is not the case. And I think that there's a problem. One of the problems of achieving reconciliation is hearing all of the voices that we're talking about, taking away from the colonialist settler mentality that we have now, and somehow incorporating them. But until somebody stands up and begins to think, through whatever process, this is what reconciliation would look like. Yes, it's understanding living together in a state of dignity and respect, but what would that actually look like? Then how do we know, what sense do we get? It's like equality or anything else. How do we know that we're moving forward towards a goal? Or is it a goal or just a condition that will exist at some point in time?
Paul, you're a man after my own heart. Let me ask for other questions from the audience.
Sorry.
No, this is something I often think about. Let me ask further questions. Yeah.
Just a comment really, so I actually did appreciate that input. I thought the family camera project, it reminded me of the project naming, I'm just referring to it, project naming from the Inuit people who have taken those archival pictures and re-narrated them by naming the people in those pictures. I think that is a way to disrupt the established testimony. I think there are ways to move forward. I think we just need to listen to those people who want to re-narrate their own histories. That's just my perspective.
Thank you.
Any thoughts on that? It's too.
It's interesting to see that the project naming, as I understand it, it came from within the institution, the Library and Archives Canada.
Right.
And at a recent conference that we co-organized as part, one of the other outcomes of this project, Carol Payne, who's involved in it, gave a presentation, and I wanted to ask, like, what was kind of the reasoning behind Library and Archives Canada but it was very interesting to see their model of collaboration that was meant to be kind of workshops in order to have Indigenous communities then train other people to undertake that kind of work, that it wouldn't be the Library and Archives Canada, you know, leading the way here. There's a similar commitment, I think, and this is why the Royal Ontario Museum was an interesting partner in this project. Initially, when we were conceptualizing it, we had a lot of questions about being involved or working with such a monolith, right? Like it's such a large institution that has had, as I alluded to, a fraught history, and you know that it has a kind of a cultural capital. It's expensive to go to the Royal Ontario Museum. We wouldn't be able to speak to that many communities. But to get to your question about what does it look like, right? If you're committed to social justice, I think that it requires imagination, even if you don't have an image or a word in your head, right? Like if you, and all of us are trained in criticism. We all know the pitfalls of taking those kinds of risks. We all know the possible, you know, attacks. I think a lot about kind of, okay, if I do it this way, then how would the public respond? If I do it another way, I think, well, if ultimately we're mobilized by kind of our anticipation of the failures, then you cannot take that kind of risk. And for me, I think being the person that I am, like, I don't need to say the kind of person that I am, like, you just see me, what I look like, that I cannot, and another public event I talked about the fact that people like me are not supposed to be on the stage of the Royal Ontario Museum. It was a round table with Deanna Bowen and Jeff Thomas, and they said they had a similar kind of sentiment, that these are not spaces that traditionally or conventionally are meant for people like us. And I think that was part of our belief. I mean, the senior curator of South Asian art that I work closely with there, I mean, she doesn't need other outsiders, other people telling her that, yeah, you are part of a high culture and how dare you speak to minorities. These are the compromises that you make if you want to get any work done. You either do that or you don't. You do something else. You work with community organizations, which is fair enough, which is fine. But you know, we happen to be in these institutions. So what are we going to do with the power, whatever power that we have? And I think that was kind of ultimately the decision that we make, and we're always questioning those decisions.
Well, I'm conscious of the fact that we have eaten into your weekend in a considerable way, and I'm glad that you were able to spend part of your weekend with us. I have a list of thank yous, and if you'll permit me, I want to make sure to thank the people who made today's event happen. So, first of all, to the College of the Royal Society, Russell McDonald, the manager of the college, Cynthia Milton, the president of the college, and the members of the College Council. They gave us an idea, and they issued a challenge to us to make this afternoon happen. So I want to thank the college for their ideas and for their support. Here at Western, I want to thank several people, some of whom are in the room. Douglas Keddy, the Research Communications Manager, thank you as always. Susanna Ayers, Communications Officer for Western Law. From Research Western, our new Associate Vice President Research, Juan Luis Suarez, thank you. Josh Lambier from Public Humanities at Western for partnering with us. Our students who have been note takers and live tweeting today's events, thank you, and for, of course, your tech support. To the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, this is a pretty cool place to hold an event like this where we're thinking about what it means for community, social justice, for the university to interact. To the participants and members of the college, Bipasha, who is in Catalonia, of all places, this week. Isaac, to T and Kelly and Sarah, who wasn't able to be here. To Nadine and Cheryl, who's, as Valerie said, soon to be elected to the college at a ceremony in Winnipeg. next month. Thank you all. To Valerie for all of her work in organizing today's event. Thank you. And let me just say to you in the audience, you didn't have to give up your Saturday afternoon, but here you are, and you're not even related to us, some of you. So thank you. I appreciate it, and let us just say from us to you, thanks very, very much.
Thank you.